Thanks, Andrea. Welcome to our last seminar on grappling with complexity. This year has flown by faster than a grad student making a decision or coming up with a reason to procrastinate for a paper. I can't believe we're already here at the end. And today it's my great privilege to introduce to you Minka Woerman. Minka is an associate professor of philosophy and the chair of the Department of Philosophy at Stellenbosch University. She has published 2 monographs on the topic of complexity, one titled Bridging Complexity and Post-Structuralism, Insights and Implications, and a second on the impossibility or possibility of business ethics, critical complexity deconstruction, and the implication for understanding the ethics of business. Today, Minka is going to talk to us about the epistemology of critical complexity. From her extract here, I've gathered that she will be directly engaging with van der Merwe's criticisms of critical complexity and its underpinning epistemological assumptions. And yeah, she'll be addressing these via Derrida's texts, which is a name we're all familiar with and I'm sure like in this group. And I very much look forward to hearing what she has to say. Over to you, Minka.
Thank you, Anton. Yes, thank you very much for having me. And Ragnar, I'm very glad that you can make it. I know you also had to shift your teaching obligations around. So it's nice to have you in the room as a respondent today. Okay, I'm going to now just attempt to share my screen. Can I just have confirmation that you can see? Good. Let me just put it on slideshow. I have quite a lot of content, so I'm going to keep the introductions very short. So as Anton already mentioned, my topic today is the epistemology of critical complexity, and I started reflecting on this topic at the hand of Ragnar's own presentation in this group and thought that perhaps it's time that I also work out precisely what the epistemological assumptions of critical complexity are. So the scope for today's presentation is, first I'm going to just briefly introduce why epistemology is an important topic for any engagement with complexity. And then I'm going to turn to Ragnar's specific objections against the epistemology underlying critical complexity. And I'm going to try to respond to these objectives via, as Anton said, Derrida's philosophy, but also extend the insights to the field of critical complexity and specifically address the issues of epistemology. And then I want to end off just with a brief sort of summary of insights that the foregoing conversation or discussion holds for complexity theory as such, and also the role of metaphor in complexity theory. So, why a concern with general epistemology, in complexity? So the traditional concern of epistemology, as you are all aware, is about the reliability of knowledge claims about our external and internal worlds. Goldstein identifies 3 reasons for why complexity has intensified interest in epistemology. Firstly, complexity challenges the traditional scientific paradigm of explanation, prediction, and control, and draws attention to the limits of our knowledge of complex phenomena. And the examples that he uses are, he uses 2 examples. The first, making accurate predictions regarding the initial conditions in chaotic systems. And then, and I think this is the more pertinent example, the explanatory gap concerning emergent phenomena, how one can move from one phenomenon and to another, and what emergence means. So Morin, the French complexity philosopher, argues that any serious engagement with complex phenomena necessitates that we undertake an epistemological, cognitive, and paradigmatic shift, which bears on the whole of organization of knowledge. So Morin's point is that we cannot continue to do science as we've been doing it in the face of complex phenomena. We must rethink the very paradigm, the epistemological paradigm that we employ. The second reason why complexity has intensified interest in epistemology is due to this phenomenon of emergence. Emergence raises questions concerning the ontological status of emergent phenomena, whether the status is genuine or whether it's just the subjective perception of the scientist. So I think emergence raises questions concerning our understanding of complexity as either an ontological phenomenon or an epistemological phenomenon. And if it's epistemology, then the reason why we can't explain emergence is simply because we don't have all the knowledge as yet. And this leads to the third problem, which is the observer problem, which was first identified by Hans von Fürster during the second wave of cybernetics, where he noted that the scientist is implicated in her observations. So our knowledge of complex systems is not neutral objective knowledge, but is the outcome of the types of experiments we're doing, the types of theoretical paradigms that we're working from, and so forth. Charles Sanders Peirce stated regarding science and maths that metaphysics leaks at every joint. And Goldstein appropriates this citation to argue that complexity theory is just making these leaks more apparent and thereby making it more difficult to conceptually avoid the underlying metaphysics. So we see that complexity raises questions of epistemology generally. However, the focus of today's presentation is not on complex phenomena generally speaking, but on the epistemological foundations of critical complexity, and specifically the criticism that Van der Merwe lodges against this perspective. Now, before addressing this criticism, I just want to give a very short overview of critical complexity in case there are listeners who are not aware of the theory. The overarching, so it was pioneered by the late Professor Paul Sillier, and I think we find the overarching objective in his very famous book titled Complexity and Postmodernism, which he wrote in 1998, which has found great traction within the complexity community. And here he defines this objective as illuminating the notion of complexity from a postmodern, or more accurately, post-structural perspective. What does this mean? Well, Sillier argues that there is no overarching theory of complexity. Complexity implies engagement with specific contingent systems. He understands complex systems moreover in terms of connectionism. So he uses neural networks as a model for understanding complex systems. And he further identifies structural similarities between neural networks and a Derridian understanding of language. And here is the post-structural slant. Post-structural philosophy can help us understand the dynamics of complex systems. Although complex systems are contingent, he does allow for general remarks regarding the conditions for complex behaviors and dynamics. And also this perspective allows for weak modeling. So a strong reduction or a strong reductivist methodology is not espoused, but it is recognized that in order to understand complex systems, in order to develop systematic knowledge of complex systems, we must model these complex systems. So Paul used to always say the best description of a complex system is the system itself, but it's also the least useful description. We need to reduce the complexity in order to do something with the system. Sillier defines critical complexity in a later text as emphasizing a self-critical rationality, which is defined as a rationality that makes no claim for objectivity or any special status for the grounds from which the claim is made. So a self-critical rationality is the outcome of acknowledging the irreducible nature of complexity. And furthermore, it inaugurates complexity as a primarily reflective and philosophical rather than a traditionally scientific exercise. But it also focuses our attention on the normativity that any serious engagement with complexity implies. Moving from this to an understanding of science, Sillier argues that adopting a post-structural perspective on science will certainly be in conflict with much of what is accepted as canonical theory of science. And indeed, this is precisely where Van der Merwe's critique comes in. So the presentation is, or my response is based specifically on Van der Merwe's article titled Perspectives and Meta-Perspectives, Context versus Hierarchy in the Epistemology of Complex Systems. And I've tried to order these critique in terms of 4 charges, and in what follows, I will address each of these charges separately. So firstly, and as concerns the charge of relativism, Van der Merwe argues that critical complexity positions itself against an analytic approach to complexity, defined by reductionism, operational closure, and a strict separation between subject and object. CC, over and against this, CC endorses the non-closure of meaning. And here he quotes me as saying, because of complexity or the non-closure of meaning, our decisions and actions cannot be objectively described, and complex systems are conceptualized as radically open and contextual. The implications that he draws from this view is that knowledge of complex systems is contingent on perspective, epistemic content is contingent on the internal rules of a specific approach. So these, it has heuristic utility, but nothing more. Meta perspectives are always provisional, and deconstruction, especially Derrida's notion of difference, is the disruption of the authority of the code as a finite system of rules. He therefore concludes that although critical complexity does not endorse a full-scale relativism, that is the acceptance of contradictory narratives, all knowledge of complex systems is the outcome of contingent and relativized perspectives. So my response would be to demonstrate that CC's acknowledgement of contingency does not imply epistemological relativism. And in order to forward this response, I turn to Christopher Norris's engagement with Derrida's essay, White Mythology. Herein, Derrida elucidates the epistemo-critical bearings of Derrida's philosophy, which I argue also inform critical complexity. So Norris begins by juxtaposing Rorty's support of textual relativism with Derrida's more nuanced engagement with contingency. Rorty is of the opinion that the idea of epistemology as first philosophy is merely a time-worn metaphor that presumes that only a theory of knowledge that can provide adequate foundations or indubitable grounds for our, that presumes that only a theory of knowledge can provide adequate grounds for our diverse projects of inquiry. And Rorty simply doesn't believe this is true. Moreover, Rorty wrongly assumes that Derrida also supports the rejection of epistemology as first philosophy, and thereby positions philosophy as just another kind of metaphoric writing. Norris identifies, in this debate, Norris identifies a continuum between literalism on the one hand and whole-scale metaphorico-poetic constructivism on the other. So the continuum ranges from a belief that scientific theories have no place for metaphor to the textualist idea that all concepts are metaphors. And I think this is almost akin to the reductionist holism debate in complexity. Derrida, following the French philosophers of science, Bachelard and Canguilhem, supports neither of these poles. In other words, he rejects literalism and textualism because literalism fails to explain scientific leaps and discovery and progress, and textualism fails to provide terms for distinguishing between valid and invalid theories. I think critical complexity, here we can draw parallels, because critical complexity asserts that contingency, like metaphor, is inescapable. But as with Derrida's engagement with metaphor, conceding to the role of contingency in critical complexity does not imply relativism, or I would argue a strong view of perspectivism. The latter, that is the strong view of perspectivism, is characteristic of Niklas Luhmann's position, and one that I specifically criticize in my book for its potentially solipsistic implications. Indeed, Luhmann's position is construed on the basis of a closed systems understanding of knowledge production. As concerns relativism, I would argue that an acknowledgement of contingency and the provisionality of our knowledge claims does not necessarily equate to relativism. Indeed, in his inaugural address, Swyer argues that limited knowledge is not any knowledge. If this were the case, any modest claim, any claim with some provisionality or qualification attached to it, would be relativistic and would force us into an arrogant self-assurance. What the recognition of contingency, like metaphor, implies is that our knowledge of complex phenomena is always partial and can thus be challenged. And how should it be challenged? Well, through the very analytic tools that we've always used: reason, logic, evidence, and in Derridian philosophy, deconstruction. The second charge lodged by van der Merwe is that of theoretical positioning. He argues that critical complexity favors a post-structural interpretation of complexity over rival interpretations, such as the scientific interpretation. So that is, CC assumes a meta position. It assumes that it is a better theory of complexity than other theories. But by doing so, van der Merwe argues that CC contradicts its own generic claim for radical contextualism. Van der Merwe concludes that CC must therefore either give up contextualism, that's its post-structural foundation, or its meta-position, that it's not just a theory of other theories, but that this would then result in full-blown relativism. Van der Merwe says that the outcome of this contradiction is that CC cannot distinguish between our best scientific theories and pseudoscience. In other words, the outcome is that it results in full-blown epistemic relativism. So an easy response to this charge is to argue that if contextualism does not necessarily imply relativism, then there is no reason for arguing that CC should abandon either contextualism or its epistemic convictions. But let's explore this apparent contradiction in a bit more detail. I would argue that this contradiction typifies or characterizes not only critical complexity, but all approaches to complexity that argue that complex systems are contingent and specific, that a theory of everything, that is a complete understanding of complex phenomena, is impossible, and that a complexity-inspired understanding of the world is nevertheless preferable to other reductionist understandings of the world. So in other words, any paradigm of complexity that loosely subscribes to what Merwe calls general complexity would run into the same problem. How should we respond to this contradiction? The apparent contradiction that van der Merwe identifies is structurally similar to the contradiction that inheres in a philosophical investigation of metaphor, that is, a theory of metaphor. Such an investigation assumes that philosophy can properly control and delimit the field of its own metaphorical production. In other words, such an investigation assumes that philosophy can escape its own defining tropes on the basis of which philosophical distinctions are produced, including the distinction between concept and metaphor. In other words, a theory of metaphor cannot escape its own metaphorical production and will always be on very tenuous grounds. However, to give up a meta-perspective, that is a theory of metaphor, amounts to textualism, whereby we have to conclude that all concepts are merely metaphors. This means that we will not be able to distinguish valid from invalid theories or progressive from non-progressive research programs. However, to forsake the metaphorical nature of all language, including philosophical concepts and scientific concepts, would mean that we would again run into the problem of literalism. We cannot explain how science can make imaginative leaps beyond the framework of pre-existing concepts. Hence, the strategy is to accept the contradiction and continue to endorse the problematic distinction between metaphor and concept in order to forward an investigation of metaphor and thereby scientific production. And what would this investigation be based on? It would be based on logic, concept, and reason. In other words, we try to still theorize a theory of metaphor in order to determine how certain concepts develop to be, how certain metaphors develop to become concepts with staying power. So I would argue that the same strategy applies here for critical complexity and complexity in general. The acknowledgement of complexity implies a certain amount of performative tension. Why? Because we are playing in what David Wood calls the theater of difficulty. Because we only have limited and contingent knowledge of complex phenomena. But again, this does not imply that we should stop investigation. In other words, forsake our metapositions, our theories of complexity at the point of identifying the performative tension. What it does imply is that we should acknowledge this tension and proceed with the task of knowledge production, including scientific knowledge production. The third charge identified by van der Merwe is that of epistemological leveling. Van der Merwe juxtaposes Marat's view of complexity with critical complexity, arguing that the former allows for epistemic progress by adopting an outward commitment to scientific knowledge. Scientific knowledge advances on average via the cumulative construction of meta points of views or meta perspectives. Van der Merwe endorses this perspective, but goes even further, arguing that the epistemic weight of a perspective should be measured in terms of its contribution to understanding, which should cash out in terms of empirical, that is, scientific success. Van der Merwe argues that critical complexity is incapable of endorsing epistemic progress due to the disruptive force of difference. Now, my response here is that difference is not just a disruptive force. It is also generative in the sense that it allows for the constitution of knowledge through the difference and distinction. So difference characterizes Derrida's philosophy as both foundational, the economic dimension, and anti-foundational, the aneconomic dimension. Moreover, these dimensions are related apparetically, and it is thus, as Andrea Hirst writes, not a case of either or all or nothing. The general economy, that of disorder, disorganization, and disruption, resides in the heart of the restricted economy, that of order, organization, and teleology. The consequence of difference is that any general theory or classificatory system, for example, Searle's Speech Act theory or a theory of everything, cannot command the entire field under investigation. Difference thus implies a recognition of ontological complexity. And this is Derrida's point. Not that incremental scientific knowledge production is untenable or that we should reject science as such. Indeed, after highlighting the performative tension that defines any philosophical investigation of metaphor, Derrida turns to the role of metaphor in scientific knowledge production. Derrida endorses Bachelard's treatment of science and philosophy of science in terms of an epistemological break and a process of ongoing rectification and critique. Bachelard argues that science makes progress precisely through breaking with the kind of intuitive self-evidence that typifies its early proto-scientific stage of inquiry, or that stand to reason, just so long as reason has not yet entered upon the path of more conceptual analysis and critique. So how scientific progress takes place is through these intuitive proto-scientific stages where we use metaphors, often visual metaphors, in order to conceptualize of in order to describe natural phenomena. But this is not yet a scientific theory. An epistemological break has to take place in order for these metaphors to gain the status of scientific concepts. And I'll return to this shortly. I think critical complexity also endorses this view. And here I would like to quote Peter Allen, who, although he doesn't identify as a critical complexity theorist, I've used his insights a lot in my own work. And I know Paul was also very sympathetic to his views. Allen writes that a representational model with no assumptions whatsoever is clearly simply subjective reality. In this way, we could say it does not therefore fall within the science of complexity, since it does not concern systematic knowledge. Allen continues in arguing that what is of importance is not whether something is absolutely true or false, but whether the apparent systematic knowledge provided is useful. Instead of viewing models as absolute representations of reality, we must be aware of and apply our complexity reduction assumptions, which are metaphors, honestly. And we should take note of when these models and metaphors need to be transformed and replaced by other more appropriate models. The last charge is the implied charge of anti-realism. And this charge becomes apparent when we contrast van der Merwe's own thesis with his views of critical complexity. Van der Merwe's thesis is as follows. He argues that we can weigh perspectives to form an objective epistemic hierarchy. We can grade perspectives and therefore knowledge and understanding according to an objective criterion. This is the criterion of empirical evidence. So from this, it becomes evident that van der Merwe still endorses the traditional scientific view of explanation, prediction, and control, where epistemic weight depends on a perspective's degree of concordance with empirical evidence. His strategy is thus to anchor theory in world. He contrasts these hierarchies of perspective with critical complexity's purported dichotomy between relativized perspectives and an absolutist God's perspective. He argues that CC only permits internal and not external constraints on knowledge, hence the implied charge of anti-realism. So critical complexity and the philosophy behind it, in other words, gives rise to relativized language gains. My response here is that neither CC nor Derridian philosophy defy the role of world in knowledge construction. And indeed, I would challenge van der Merwe to come up with evidence to the contrary, where CC or Derridian philosophy espouse a solipsistic view. Indeed, Derrida, to make my case, I refer again to Derrida, who endorses Bachelard's Le Rationalism appliqué, critical application in explaining scientific advances, as the outcome of a dialectical interrogative exchange between intuitive insights and rational method, tested against world. Derrida argues that during periods of Kuhnian revolutionary science, new hypotheses are theorized, but without as yet adequate supporting observational data or an established theory. In other words, Kuhnian revolutionary science is often precipitated by these intuitive leaps based on metaphor. And as I said, metaphors in this proto-scientific stage are often image-based. But whether these metaphors can lead to genuine scientific insight is contingent on a process of critical rectification, whereby their truth content is gradually separated from their metaphoric origins. Derrida, with reference to Bachelard, asks, does not a scientific critique's rectification rather proceed from an inefficient tropic concept that is poorly constructed to an operative tropic concept that is more refined and more powerful in a given field and at a determined phase of the scientific process? So Derrida looks to the philosophy of science, specifically the French philosophy of science, for these truth-tropic metaphors. So in summary, I hope that the foregoing response hopefully serves to dispel the misguided dichotomy between science and metaphor, or between an analytic and post-structural account of complexity. Indeed, both Norris and Iscia comment on this misguided dichotomy. Norris says, "For there really is no point in staging this issue." And I'm not going to read the full quote for the sake of time, but Iscia also says, "Generally speaking, these dichotomies serve mostly as stumbling blocks or as ways to dismiss intellectual opponents, and not as a framework for fruitful discussion." Norris argues that what such debates essentially ignore is the crucial difference between poetic metaphors and metaphors which, by virtue of their capacity for further development, can evolve into truth-tropic metaphors, that is, into concepts. And I think that this process is largely overlooked in van der Merwe's account of epistemic hierarchies with potentially negative consequences. So in conclusion, I want to look at three potential consequences that may come about as a result of ignoring the role of metaphorical development in theory construction. The first is the endorsement of a strictly literal and teleological view of knowledge production. The second is an uncritical acceptance of the truth-tropic status of theories of complex adaptive systems as such. And the third is a restriction of the scope of complexity applications to the scientific domain, or more weakly, inadequate attention to the validity of metaphoric transfer. As concerns the endorsement of a strictly literal and teleological view of knowledge production, I argue that attributing epistemic weight solely to a perspective's degree of concordance with empirical evidence, as does van der Merwe, runs into the same problems as literalism. That is, it fails to explain scientific leaps and progress. Why? Because every link in the chain of knowledge production is governed by a strictly immobile order of truth-preserving relations, to use Derrida's phrasing of his critique of Aristotle's theory of metaphor. Although van der Merwe does state that he does not support a theory of everything, his hierarchy perspective has a definite teleological thrust. Van der Merwe also still explicitly endorses the epistemology of the classical sciences predicated on explanation, prediction, and control, and hence a restricted approach to complexity. Morin warns, in terms of restricted complexity, that when one searches for the laws of complexity, one still attaches complexity as a kind of wagon behind the truth locomotive, that which produces laws. Although one avoids the problem of complexity, which is epistemological, actually one avoids the problem of complexity, which is epistemological, cognitive, and paradigmatic. To some extent, one recognizes complexity, but by decomplexifying it. And it's particularly that last line, which I think hierarchy of epistemic hierarchy will run into. Secondly, and as concerns the uncritical acceptance of the truth-tropic status of theories of complex adaptive systems as such, I argue that ignoring metaphor in theory production, especially complexity theory production, means that leads to an inadequate investigation of the theories and concepts that we use in complexity research as such. Why? And I think Chetty Baram summarizes the issue very well. She identifies a peculiar feature of complex adaptive systems stemming from their diverse heritage. She writes that the notion of complex adaptive systems within complexity theory has evolved to become an ontological claim based upon experiments conducted across disciplines ranging from physics to biology to computer science. Any talk of the features of a complex adaptive system is thus based upon an already abstracted set of features and characteristics, which constitute what is known as complexity theory. Thus, a source domain here does not exist in the true sense. Those critical of the nature and features of complexity theory, not just critical complexity, view the theory as informed speculation because it has its source in so many subject domains. So again, just to summarize, ignoring the process of metaphorical production, development, and transfer in complexity science does not allow for critical analysis of the scientific status of complexity knowledge. And then the last concern is the restriction of the scope of complexity applications to the scientific domain, or, as I said, weaker, inadequate attention to the validity of metaphoric transfer. So critical complexity and complexity theory as such has much wider applicability beyond science. And any comprehensive view of complexity must be able to account for the possibility of this wider application. Grounding epistemic weight in evidence-based science cannot account for complexity applications in other fields, such as economics, political science, management, and technology. Even assuming that the theory could be extended, there would be no grounds for assessing the epistemic content of these different applications, because van der Merwe does not acknowledge contextualism. However, the import of these theories in non-scientific disciplines also warrant investigation in terms of their epistemic content. Again, and following Chetty Baram, a theory of metaphor can assist with this task. Why? Because a theory of metaphor concerns both a theory of construction, as I have demonstrated, and a theory of transfer. So just briefly, what does this theory of transfer mean? Chetty Baram explains that etymologically speaking, metaphor means to carry over or to transfer from a source domain to a target domain. It is the ontological mappings across contextual domains via thought and reason, and in a manner that holds together systems of relations. So we take concepts from the source domain and we transfer them in the target domain, and the transfer or the validity of the transfer is dependent on correspondences, not on features that can be mapped by virtue of similar roles in relational structures. So she calls it structure mapping. Indeed, Ricoeur concurs with this view of metaphorical transfer. He says in the case of metaphor, the paradigmatic structures resemblances. And this requires, in order to judge the validity of metaphorical transfer, requires reasonable knowledge of both the source and the target domain, and effort to abstract and elucidate essential relational features, and also an acknowledgement that the complexity terminology will remain metaphors in the target domain until reasonable grounds exist for the reconceptualization of the target domain as complex adaptive systems. So then in conclusion, I hope to have demonstrated why the charges leveled against critical complexity and its post-structural base by van der Merwe are based on a partial and inadequate understanding of critical complexity. And secondly, I hope to have shown why the recognition of contextualism and metaphorical development, including metaphorical transfer, is vital to developing a sound epistemology of the complex systems and the concepts used in complexity theory. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. While I was listening to you, Minka, I was reminded of a quote by Box and Draper on epistemology that I really like. It said, all models are wrong. The practical question is how wrong they have to be not to be useful. And just listening to your talk, I was very strongly reminded of that and the implications. I know Jean Bolton has a question right off the bat. I know also Jean's time is precious. She needs to go. So I'm going to open up the floor to Jean, and then we'll give some others opportunity to fire off some questions. Hi, Jean.
Hi, thanks. Hi, Minka. Good to see you. That was absolutely fascinating and fantastic. Really, really good. I really appreciated that. And the one thought that I'm grappling with at the moment, and perhaps we can talk some more about this, is in a sense the ontological issue of is the universe complex, and the need to then redefine what science is. And I'm really interested in how scientists at the moment are kind of grappling with stuff like the beginnings of the universe, or quantum gravity, or the implications of thermodynamics, which of course was Prigogine and Alan's great kind of theme. That if in a sense the universe is complex, if there's a kind of ontology of complexity, then we need to rethink science as something that is more contingent and historically based and partial. So that's where it kind of takes me. I'm going to have to dash off, but I'd love to get your views on that, really. Thank you for a wonderful talk.
Thank you very much, Jean. No, I agree. I think the sort of is complexity an ontological or epistemological problem. I mean, that we cannot really sort out. We experience the world as complex. So I assume, well, I do think, along with Paul, that complexity isn't just, or resolving complexity isn't just a matter of more advanced tools and processing power and so forth, for the reason that I don't think that there's a central organizing principle play in many sort of natural phenomena, definitely not in social phenomena, and perhaps also not in natural phenomena. So there's no central organizing principle at play, then we cannot decompose the system in the way that we have always done science, for example. And then it would indeed imply the sort of epistemological paradigm shift that Merwe has in mind. And I don't think that this means that we should forsake the world. I like Merwe, he also says he's a co-constructivist. We give a bit and the world gives, but we cannot just have constructivist theories. That's not useful at all. They have to be tested against reality. But we should recognize that the status of our theories are not an objective portrayal of reality, but that they are constructed in part on the basis of the tools at our disposal, including the metaphors that we use. And these metaphors gain traction if they do, or if they create useful results, if they concur with our empirical observations of reality, and then become concepts over time. But these concepts, they still retain the metaphorical residue, and concepts can be overthrown. That's great. And that's a good thing, because it allows for precisely these Kuhnian revolutionary steps in science, leaps in science.
Yeah, no, well, that was wonderful, thank you. But I'd like to pick up on the kind of, so what is the nature of science is a kind of the next question for me.
It's a big, philosophy of science.
But thank you very much, thank you.
Thank you very much for attending, Gina. I appreciate it.
Great, I see Mario, you have a comment question?
I really enjoyed it, Minka.
Thank you, Mario.
I'm not a philosopher. I've got a few years of philosophy behind me, but I'm a physical chemist. So physical chemistry kind of gives you a close view of the world with entropy and laws regarding energy and information, all that kind of stuff, which is a nice framework. If you describe the world, there's certain boundaries. And so even physics, I think to a certain extent does do that. But what I'm really interested in working in complexity myself is from the perspective of a background in so-called soft operations research, where that field had to move from modeling things to say, we make a clear distinction between the world and the model. So in soft systems methodology, all the classical textbooks, you draw a line on the paper, and above is the world, and then you model below, and you cycle between the model and the world. So it's actually a wonderful discipline that takes knowledge of you are testing, and the catworm model, for example, looks at your Weltanschauung as part of the things that you are discussing, developing the model. So the world and your perspectives and your history and your culture comes into the picture. So it's really a special group of people, I think, because they tackle things like the national hospital system in the UK. And there's been famous studies done by Chapman, where you're looking at all the problems of incentive structures and how the system then responds to adapt to those incentive structures and maximize individual hospital money and your own money and all that kind of stuff. To get to the point, at the moment, our government, I'm battling, there's two things. There's a lot of talk about sense making in complexity, where people talk to business people and say, look, let's make sense of the world so your business can improve. And this sense making as being boosted as it's a collaborative process, as you said, where people talk about their context and they figure out what is worthwhile next to do. So it's very much on the useful side of it. So what's useful to do? What have we found useful? Does it work in every case? And just finally, the one thing that really, really interests me at the moment is our government is a developmental government. They've got a strategy of saying, let's view a district, a geographical area, district municipality as a system. And we want to develop a one model for all the interventions and their results in a district. Now that's really going beyond the pale in terms of the complexity, but at the same time, it's such a wonderful challenge because local economic development has always been premised in government on a certain amount of money, and you invest that money in this context, and people are supposed to have a voice in this and a participatory processes. So I get back to, at the moment, I'm trying to build a consortium of people that would actually like to tackle this because it's being tackled by technological perspectives. So let's get the data. Well, you have data from Stats South Africa, demographic data, but it seems to me that central to that is the whole process of people engaging from different perspectives. We are managing a system, infrastructure management and long-term planning, all that kind of thinking. And then there's the thing of people having agency and entrepreneurial development. And so it's trying to, are we correct in actually trying to adopt this sort of one plan, one district model in the first instance? Shouldn't we create a different framework of thinking to handle it? And so I would love it to talk to you offline and other people that are interested in, because it's really a fundamental problem I work in the, I've got a qualification in information systems. We're looking at the user reaction to the information system. So what does it does for me? And what's fascinating is that we've been studying computer systems and people since 1970. IBM, the field started there, and we still haven't cracked it. We've gone into AI and it's even a deeper mess. But now the first step we take is actually to focus on the data and the formalization of that data into information systems and into decision-making. And that's the only trend of thought I see. And then you've got the activist that says, look, we have a social problem here. And it really drives me nuts that we don't get a consortium of people together to just, using the term again, to kind of build the most useful model that we can based on different perspectives. So that's kind of my project for the moment. And so I'd like some inputs on that because it's kind of crazy what the government's doing. Well,
it's a very big topic. So I'm just going to make some preliminary remarks. Firstly, social systems are vastly complex. Precisely, you don't have this, it's not science in the strict formal sense of science where you can test experiments against the real world, whether your hypotheses conform with what is happening. So
you can test it. I would you can test it. People doing randomized control and testing.
You've got the double hermeneutic loop. Research on human beings, the research actions may change again. So the system itself is much more dynamic. But being a complex system, obviously you can model it from different perspectives, and the data modeling is one perspective, but a sort of a political modeling based use of different stakeholders is another model. And that these models, to develop the most comprehensive view of a complex system, one should actually be undertaking all this modeling simultaneously. Also recognize that because social systems are dynamic, one needs a type of model that can update as systemic changes take place. I would definitely recommend that you look at Roberto Poli's views on anticipatory models. So an model is a model that we draw of the future. So the trajectory of the model always runs faster than the system. Okay, so we create a model of a system and we let it run and see what area do you land up? Is it desirable? If it's not, is it not desirable? If it's desirable, you build in effectors into the system in order to get the system back on track.
Right.
You have to update the model to also reflect systemic changes. So, for example, if
wonderful. Yeah.
If I want to be a doctor, then I have an anticipatory model of myself in the future. But in the present, I have to do certain things in order to become a doctor. So the model of the future guides the present action.
Yes.
The trajectory of the system by leaving these effectors. So that works well.
Grant, thank you. I'd like to drop you a line, and because I've done some future studies work as well, and what the Finns do is exactly that. Their parliament actually has a department. I was trained by the head of that department, where the Finnish parliament looks at the future and says, what is the desired future for our police force? And then they work back to achieve it, not the normal sort of shell kind of stereo.
Exactly. And Mabata maps that interaction between system and model quite well.
Right.
Great,
okay,
thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you for questions and comments. I know that there's at least one participant that's very eager to respond to.
Yes, I'm also very eager to hear from that participant.
So, Ragnar, I'm going to open up the floor to you.
Okay, hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, thanks, Minka. Thanks for the talk, and thanks for paying attention to my critique of CC. I don't have a problem with the emphasis on metaphor or contingency. I'm quite happy for the sake of this discussion to grant that all perspectives are at least imbued with some contingency, and that we could even say that scientific language is metaphorical by its nature. My issue is that there must be good and bad metaphors, of course. Otherwise, you've got the kind of relativism that you want to avoid.
Yeah.
And in white mythology, Derrida talks about good metaphors, bad metaphors. And you've spoken a number of times about the value of logic and reason and empirical evidence, testing reality. But the question becomes, why are these criteria on a constructivist account, why are these criteria important as epistemic devices rather than others? And the only answer I can find in Celia's, Derrida or Norris is that certain practices are more long-lived than others. So there's a long human tradition of using things like empirical evidence, logic, mathematics, and so we continue to use them. But there's nothing other than that actually binds our epistemic systems or constrains them. It's only that they're more long-lived. And I just want to read a quote, very quick one. In white mythology, Derrida says, signification by its capacity for metaphorical displacement will be in what we might think of as a state of readiness, lying between the nonsense which precedes language and the truth of that language which tells it how it is. But it's not a guaranteed truth. There can be bad metaphors. Are there metaphors at all? This question can only be dealt with in terms of a theory of value supported by a theory of truth. And that theory of value belongs within rhetoric, which cannot be neutral. So there's a clear expression of internalism. So any judgment on the value of metaphors or any appeal to empirical evidence must itself be metaphorical and therefore rhetorical, linguistic, and internal. And so then you're back to the situation of being unable to appeal to the external world. The external world itself is a metaphor. Derrida is quite explicit about that in white mythology. He says the sun is a metaphor. So
the word sun, how we understand sun is a metaphor. I don't, you see, I think I understand what you're saying. Sorry, I interrupted you now. Did you want to continue?
No, that's fine. That's fine.
Yeah, I think that Doris, that quote that you've just read now, Derrida warns that, so for Derrida, language is fundamentally unanchored from the world. From the move from language as a representational system, the world is given, and our task as humans is to take these concepts and just match them to things in the world. But the recognition that language isn't representational, the recognition that language is dynamic, the recognition that the relation between the signifier and the signified is arbitrary, and so forth, all has a consequence that language is fundamentally unanchored from world. So there's no direct representation or correspondence between language and world. Language becomes a formal system that we use to navigate our experiences of world, but language isn't representational. So if you concede that point, then you have to concede that we can say things in language about world, and we do the whole time, and we refer to world when we come up with theories and scientific theories. But hoping for this one-on-one correspondence between world and language, I think that's what Derrida is critiquing. And he says the moment we assume that, the moment we anchor language in world, then we have this, yes, criterion of truth, but it's an ill-founded criterion precisely because it doesn't recognize that even that anchoring is itself part of a sort of theoretical construction of relation between language and world. So I don't see how you can escape that problem. The fact that certain perspectives are more valid than others, precisely because they have longer longevity, precisely because they are useful tools in helping us understand world and our engagement with world, and they can be overthrown. They can be overthrown. I think that is essentially what this view that I presented today allows for. And I don't think that's weakness.
But if I ask, why are certain epistemic systems more long-lived? Then
more useful.
Why are they more useful?
Because it allows us to understand the theory of gravity, allows us to understand why if an apple falls from a tree, it will fall at this rate or will always fall at this constant rate. I mean, theories of the world allows us to understand the world and orientate ourselves in the world. So we need the world. There's a code, as I said, it's co-constructivist, but because language doesn't allow for this one-on-one representation with world, our theories will always be, I think the only criterion is the longevity and the sort of broad acceptance, scientific acceptance of the theory.
Mm-hmm.
I agree that there's no one-to-one mapping, but I mean, there's no one-to-one reference, but our theoretical systems, whether linguistic or formal scientific theories, what I'm saying is that they must be mapping onto the external world. I don't see how the post-structuralists can say that. So everything I understand about post-structuralism indicates that an appeal to empirical evidence is not an appeal to something epistemically binding outside of rhetoric or outside of language. Appeal to empirical evidence is itself rhetorical and linguistic, and the only reason we respect empirical evidence is because there's a long human tradition of doing so. And that comes straight out of Cilliers and Derrida.
I mean, like if you take this French philosophy view of science, how do you move from a sort of poetic metaphor to a scientific concept? What allows metaphors to be stripped of their metaphorical concept and sediment as concepts?
Well, Derrida was going to say it's only because there's a long tradition.
No, he said, yeah, rectification and critique measured against the external world and the success of the concept in giving us useful knowledge. I don't see
I'm
why.
afraid I'm going to have to interject because we are running over time. This is such a fascinating debate, and I really hope one day we can do this in person over a glass of wine, which I think would be a fascinating thing to witness. And I apologize that I'm sort of interjecting in this way, but I have to hand over to Andrea to kind of wrap up the seminar series for us. And hopefully this is the beginning of more conversations on this. Over to you, Andrea.
Okay, thanks, Anton, and sorry, Minka and Ragnar, for interrupting your conversation, but with the proviso that we very, very much want to continue this kind of conversation in much, much more depth, next year and in person. In person, it would be really a wonderful thing to do. So I will make contact with everybody and see what we can come up with there. It's absolutely mind-blowing to me that we're actually edging towards the end of another academic year, and that this is the final presentation in our series, our Grappling with Complexity series. So what I'd like to do at the end of this session, and that's why I apologize very much for interrupting you, but I'd really just like to take a few minutes to just say thank you, to acknowledge and to say thank you to all of the diverse presenters that presented during the course of this year. So firstly, of course, I'd like to acknowledge Anton Botha, my co-host, who after kind of many years of working at the UN has returned to academic life for a bit and is working on a PhD in social studies at Durham University. He offered us some really fascinating insights into neurobiology of binary thinking, and later he applied this to this really tricky negotiation between national sovereignty and global government. So I'd also like to thank Gary Kukumur, Vulindlela Nyoni, and Nemaya Latola for their presentation on race and complexity. And here I have to thank Glenn Holtzman for his honesty. The space is not enough, not nearly enough for this topic, and his enthusiasm, which inspired a kind of offshoot series of dialogues about race between these four thinkers, as well as a fifth conversation partner, who's sometimes quietly in the background in our series, in the audience, Denai Tembo. I'd like to thank Hayley Lockhead, who has an MA in philosophy and experience teaching at the Green School in Cape Town. And she offered a presentation on education for complexity, or educating for complexity. And also hailing from Cape Town, Kaushik Sucharan from the UCD Business School, who delved into lived complexity ethics and the pursuit of character development. And then moving up country, Ragnar, who we've also chatted a bit to today, van der Merwe, who's a PhD candidate at UJ. He has compared analytical and post-structural perspectives on making sense in a complex world. And as you can see, generated a whole lot of conversation and hopefully future conversation about that. And then we took ourselves out of the country. So I'd very much like to thank Brian Castellani of Durham University. He's a world-renowned expert in complexity studies, and he gave us an overview, a very illuminating overview of complexity and its role in global civic society. And Bruce Jones for joining us in those very wee hours of the morning in Florida, or from Florida. He brought a kind of an African philosophy as inactivism into the spaces of complexity thinking. I'd like to thank another complexity expert, this time hailing from Stellenbosch University, Rika Preser, for her insightful presentation on complexity and relational ethics. And then moving across the world again and across disciplines, Magdalena Kluman, speaking from Hong Kong University, offered us this fascinating look into the complex real world of soft technology and low carbon energy. And Jean Bolton from the world of quantum physics at the universities of Bath and Cranfield. She offered this really illuminating account of process complexity. That's also had quite a lot of influence throughout the seminar. Then back in the Eastern Cape, Chris Alsobrook from Fort Hare University delved into the complexities of ideology critique, and Abraham Olivier, also from Fort Hare, introduced us to the complexity of pain. So as you can see, so far already, it's been a heady ride. So I'd very much like to thank David Byrne, another expert in complexity studies, for walking us through his complex, realistic approach to inequality, climate crisis, COVID. And again, Glenn Holtzman for his memorable, let's say, presentation on the complexity of creativity, where he applied complexity to the idea of a musical orgasm. and also regular contributors to the seminar as both audience and presenters. I again want to thank Gary Kokamur and Vulindlela Nyoni for an engaging conversation on those practicalities and complexities of political activism right here in our city. I want to thank Jackie Look and Sharon Rudman, Nelson Mandela University, for this window into the complex world of language teaching, and Christy van der Westhuizen, also Nelson Mandela University, for this insightful engagement with that complex invisibility, ignorance, innocence triad that kind of bedevils, let's say, whiteness. And then moving towards the end of our series and across the world again, I'd like to thank Ian Buchanan, well-known expert in Deleuze studies who hails from the University of Wollongong, Australia, for making the connection between complexity and assemblage theory. Mario might well find a connection with him also quite interesting. And finally, it was really fitting, I think, to end the series with another expert in complexity thinking, Minka Woerman, who we've just heard a very in-depth and detailed discussion of the epistemological assumptions underpinning critical complexity. Minka is also from Stellenbosch University. So if you look back over this whole series, it's been a really rich and diverse conversation. I mean, as any conversation on complexity should be. And I really want to thank all of the presenters in this series for their contributions. And of course, all of the slightly less visible conversation partners who joined us regularly with comments and questions. So thanks to everybody. For me, it's been an invigorating space. All of the presentations, as you know, are accessible on YouTube, and I really hope to take the conversation further in some way, and definitely in an in-person engagement maybe next year. But of course, we'll have to see what COVID brings to us. Hopefully not, a fourth or fifth wave in 2022. But yes, that's it for me. Thank you very much.
Just before we sign off, Andrea, we also have to extend a big thank you to you for being the brainchild behind the seminar series and for your contributions that kicked us off and got our brains thinking in this direction. So thanks for putting it all together, and a big applause to you for making this happen.
Okay, thanks, Anton. Thanks, everybody. And have a fabulous weekend. We will pick this up anon. Okay, cheers.
Thanks, everyone.